All right, I think that's my cue. So with that, I'll convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, September 27th, 2022. Welcome to everybody who's here, and thanks to our commissioners for being here tonight. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it? All right, then we'll have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to come and speak to us on pretty much any item they would like to. And it sounds like Sharon Busher is here to speak.
Sharon,
welcome, Sharon.
You've got the mic.
Hi, sorry, Charles, I actually am here to listen and educate myself by listening to the commission's discussion about tonight's agenda item. So I'm just here as the ghost listener here, and thank you so much.
All right, well, thanks for being here, Sharon.
You're welcome.
Anyone else, Charles?
Nope, that's it, Andy.
All right, then we'll close that item, move to item 3, which is chair's report, of which there isn't any. So we'll move to item 4, which is director's report. Megan.
All right, thank you. Do have a couple of updates for you tonight. In previous meetings, we've talked to you about some of the other projects that are on our department's work plan for this year, including some of our projects that carried over from last year. And wanted to share a couple of those that are getting off the ground as we speak, really. We've talked before about the fact that one of the projects we'll be working on is an update to our impact fee ordinance that is a part of the city zoning ordinance. And if you're unfamiliar, this is kind of a number of fees that are levied on new developments that fund capital infrastructure in different city utilities and infrastructure. We have not updated this ordinance in quite some time. So this study will help us evaluate kind of the rationale that is used for levying this fee, what the fee amount should be, and how to prioritize utilizing the revenue that's collected from these fees in different city capital projects. So we're sharing the project with the Regional Planning Commission. They are helping provide the funding for looking at our transportation impact fees specifically. And glad to report that they issued the notice to proceed for the consultant that will be helping us with that transportation impact fee just today, actually. We are also getting ready tomorrow to release a request for proposals for a consultant or a team of consultants to help us look at the other fees that we have. So those are for parks, schools, public safety, and library. So we're looking forward to sharing updates with you as this project goes on in terms of kind of what we're finding about this kind of important piece of our zoning ordinance and important piece of how we regulate new development in the city. A related project that we've talked about at the Planning Commission level is the Transportation Demand Management Study. So we talked about this recently in the context of the zoning changes that were referred to you by the City Council, and the importance of using this study to inform not only the current requirements that we have in our zoning ordinance, but also future expansions or alternative methods for implementing TDM in the city. We actually were Charles and I were just at the Council's Transportation, Energy, and Utilities Committee just before this meeting to share an outline of the scope of work for an RFP for that project as well. And we anticipate that an RFP will be going out for that within the next month so that we can get that work going. In the context of TDM, I wanted to share that I think I'd previously told you in one of my reports that the council was getting ready to take up, have a public hearing and consider adoption for those parking changes that you all saw at one of their meetings earlier this summer. That's been postponed until October. They did have the public hearing at their meeting earlier this month, but they delayed any discussion and action on it until next month. So what that means is that because they held the public hearing, they warned and held the public hearing, that ordinance is currently in effect. The changes that we talked about, and it's waiting adoption by the city council. We do know and have heard some newer concerns recently, especially by the affordable housing development community about some of the existing standards. So this is nothing about what you all saw as changes to the ordinance. This is really about what was adopted back in 2020 and how some affordable housing developers are having trouble kind of fitting into the rubric for TDM that already exists in our zoning ordinance and are requesting kind of an interim solution that would help address some of the flexibility that they need. So I would expect that the council will probably end up working on some sort of amendment to that ordinance before it's adopted to address some of those concerns. And then last set of updates for you all have to do with Missing Middle, another project that will be on your radar soon. We had originally had a tour scheduled to walk around some of the neighborhoods that are just south of downtown and view some existing examples of Missing Middle. That was postponed last week because of the weather, like everything our department has planned this summer. So that has been rescheduled to this Thursday evening at 5:30. If any of you are interested in joining, we're going to meet at City Hall Park and the tour will be about an hour. We'll also have a tour on October 9th in the afternoon, where we'll actually walk through parts of the Old North End with Preservation Burlington. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of the neighborhood as a working class neighborhood, as well as some of the Missing Middle housing examples. So hopefully you can join us for one of those. And if you can't, I actually noticed that at the Vermont Development Conference that'll be taking place in mid-November, there will actually be a session about Missing Middle, about what it is and why it's important in the context of Vermont's housing policy and development challenges. So if any of you might be interested in attending, I'll drop a link to that conference in the chat. It's just a single day conference in November. And if you'd like to go, let us know, because we could probably fund your registration if you're interested. So lots of opportunities to learn about Missing Middle housing before we start talking about it fully at the commission level. And I think that's all I have for you.
Great, thanks, Megan. So we'll move on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment for South End Innovation District overlay. Charles, I think this is yours.
All right, so we are back in front of you. We've got a discussion mostly to continue the focus on the issues we talked about in the last meeting. And then hopefully once we get through those, we can run through the draft amendment language. The goal, ideally, tonight, we would get you to a place where you may feel comfortable warning a hearing, which would be in late October on the 25th. But do understand that there are some outstanding issues, and given that that a few of you a few of the commissioners are not here, we'll see how we do. So in your packet, you should have seen the memo that described the discussion to date on these outstanding items, which include hotels, specifically whether or not to permit hotels, what the rationale would be to permitting hotels. Thus far, the discussion has really revolved around, do the benefits of hotels, specifically the economic development and recruitment benefits, the opportunities they provide or afford for remote work, and also recreation in the South End, do those benefits outweigh the potential competition that hotels represent for land, specifically for residential uses? The second item that we've talked about with you and that you've been discussing has been whether or not to permit or to permit residential uses in new buildings only, or in anywhere in the district, we've talked about, well, does allowing residential uses in existing buildings pose a threat to some of the non-residential, i.e. office, artist, maker spaces in the district? The third item is building height, and there's a related discussion about floor area ratio that we'll have tonight, hopefully. And finally, blocks and streets. And so structured a presentation to begin with those items, and we'll see how far we get. And then, like I said, we can run through the amendment after that. So let me just juggle my screen here a bit. And I will share. All right. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So just for folks who may be joining or watching afterwards, just a quick recap. So the key question here with the South End Innovation District overlay proposal is, how can the city and the community re-envision large, underdeveloped or undeveloped and vacant surface parking lots in the South End to facilitate the creation of a new mixed-use district that includes places for new homes, hundreds of new homes specifically, and also space for the existing artist maker community, as well as the burgeoning office sector in the South End. When we talk about the proposed boundary for the Innovation District, we're talking about an area from the waterfront on the west to Pine Street on the east, and stretching from Howard Street in the north to just south of Sears Lane, excluding, I should note, Barge Canal and a few properties along Pine Street. None of the existing area that is in the proposed boundary includes residential uses today. Those are not permitted in the existing enterprise light manufacturing district. The intent of the Innovation District is to create a vibrant urban district with a mix of uses, again, that can be home to hundreds of new households in Burlington, and where arts, making, manufacturing, and office uses can coexist, and where the ethos of innovation extends through the construction and sustainability of the district itself. So in summary, the proposal reflects community input and the adopted plan BTB South End, which started the call for the Innovation District, and the subsequent community commitment to provide housing as a human right, which includes substantially increasing the supply of housing in the city of Burlington. So again, the four outstanding issues: hotels, residential use, location, building height, and blocks and streets. So we'll start with hotels. Last time, I think you all discussed the breadth of, I think, issues that are pertinent to whether or not hotels should be permitted in the district. And it is staff's recommendation that if the commission does feel like hotels should be permitted, they should be limited in some way. We discussed last time, one per lot, and or requiring the provision of community benefits in their development. And in thinking about community benefits for the development of hotels, we did, Commissioner Gahn, brought some ideas about hotels elsewhere that include an arts component. And I think we talked about a few examples from elsewhere: Cincinnati, Toronto, Durham in particular. And these are hotels that, highlight local artists, provide gallery space in the hotels themselves. We also looked at communities that I think experience similar concerns regarding hotels, specifically their impact on community character and the potential threat they may pose to residential stock in the city or supply of housing in those cities. And In your memo, we did mention the city of Asheville in particular is one city that stands out as having done quite a bit of work on community benefits in hotels. I'm happy to walk through sort of some work that they put together and have adopted. I should say that, you know, if the commission does feel like, you know, requiring community benefits in hotel development is a route it would like to go down, it would likely take some time to calibrate what those benefits may be. So we'd have to talk about whether or not that that piece of work gets, you know, subdivided off of the amendment or not. But essentially, you know, this is a community benefits table that Asheville has adopted. They essentially have a points-based system wherein hotel developers are required to obtain a certain amount of points relative to the number of hotel beds they're building. And you can see up here in the top left, so a hotel with 35 rooms and under has to achieve 140 points out of all of this table. And importantly, in Asheville, this is a community much like Burlington where housing costs are a significant concern, particularly for the arts community and the working class in the city. And so 50% of all points obtained by developers there have to come from this first group that is all about providing funds for affordable housing or the city's recently created reparations fund. And then the remaining points can come from different categories that relate to things like public art, to contracting with MWBE businesses, B Corps. You can see them here. But essentially, you know, in creating a complex system like this, Asheville spent probably at least a year creating this. And so just keep that in mind. I think that if you do want to apply requirements for community benefits, that's just something to consider. Do you want to be very specific? Michael talked, we've talked with him about specifically applying arts-based community benefit standards to some of these. And some things that came up in our research were hotels that do provide studio space within them, artist in residence space. So those are sort of types of benefits that could be required. Of course, if benefits is not, you know, the road you want to take, limiting hotels to one per lot is something we discussed last time. And an acknowledgement that realistically, feasibly, given the total number of properties, which is quite small in the district, despite its large size, and the fact that the city owns a handful of these lots, realistically, we're talking about, you know, at most a handful of hotels in the proposed innovation district. So that's generally where we've left the hotel discussion. So I think the question in front of you is, do you want to permit hotels? And if so, in what way would you like to limit them, if at all?
So do folks want to weigh in on this one?
I can just maybe, Andy, you know, maybe for you and Julia and Alex, just remind everybody, because I drove some of this where I came from. So I thought Charles did a nice job summarizing things, but, you know, I think there's another couple of considerations. In the public meetings, there was some pushback against this, and I think it was really in the sense that people didn't want tourists around and they wanted to have a neighborhood character. And so I really view this as a compliment to the arts community, remote work, office sort of job center that the innovation is intended to be. So I just kind of want to reiterate that this is not, you know, I don't think, and I think it should be extremely limited to prevent it from becoming, you know, something that competes with downtown, but rather it is to enhance the purposes of the innovation district, and also, you know, hopefully absorb some of the probably unpermitted Airbnb demand that will remain despite, your very hard work. That is just kind of hard to control. So I think it serves those purposes, kind of extended stay, remote work, office type visitors. But do think it should be limited.
Let me just ask a follow-up question to that one. If it is limited, how do we limit it? Like if we say we only want it to be, like we don't want it to be for tourists, we only want it to be for remote workers or something like that. Are we even able to do that? Or once the hotel is built, it's built and they could do whatever they want. So
Well, Megan and Charles may have an answer. I suppose my quick answer, Andy, would be that I think hotels, particularly in a place like Burlington, operate similar to restaurants, where you have agglomeration effects. And if you can't get a room at the Garden Inn, you go to the other Hilton,
right.
Based upon some characteristics that you want to be nearby. Or if there's only one and it's kind of in the periphery, then it has a little bit different character in terms of what it serves. But obviously there's only so much you can do.
Yeah. So I think if we have a hotel there, if we put hotels there, we have to assume that well, we can't really control the use. And so you have to assume that to my mind, that it would just get used however it gets used. Whatever it evolves into is how it would get used in terms of the hotel aspect of it. But Alex?
I'm just thinking about this, the issues that Charles raises, and sort of I think that while they are an attractive element to the, innovation district, what is the larger picture of hotels in Burlington? Like, Charles, Megan, do you have any concept of our, a typical vacancy rate in Burlington? There's also at least 2 hotel projects that are permitted and have not been built. One at the old YMCA on the corner of College and South Union Street, and the other one was at George Street on Pearl in the north part of basically downtown. Like, do we need more hotels? What's the demand? They're not, and the other point is, do we have so much land in these lots that we can afford to carve some out for hotels? This is a housing development, right?
So there are several questions there. I think Charles and I can kind of take them together. In terms of vacancy rate for hotels, I don't know, Charles, if you know off the top of your head that number. I think anecdotally have been hearing that it's pretty low, but don't have solid numbers in front of me about that.
I wouldn't expect you to know that right off the top of your head.
Well, the only reason I'm kind of kicking it over to Charles to see if he knows is because we also have been looking at some of the other commercial vacancy information that you had requested, thinking about office space, but I don't remember if hotels was part of the study that we had looked at. Right.
Hotels wasn't, but yeah, I just remember in terms of office, the South End had one of the lowest vacancy rates in the region. In fact, I think it was the lowest, and had performed the best among sort of subsectors. I can't say whether that extends to hotels.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I anecdotally heard, the same things Megan has heard.
And I think to that point, and Michael said this already, but I think we have heard an argument in favor of permitting more hotel development in the city is a way to help offset the demand that we see for Airbnbs, which is really much more in conflict with the kind of housing preservation goals that we have. So I think as far as some of the hotels, the permitted hotels that you had mentioned, I think those projects have definitely seen stagnation, and it's unclear if those 2 in particular will come to fruition in Burlington. I know there is a third kind of on the radar as part of the city place development. But again, as far as the kind of feasibility and ultimate success of building those, I think is to be determined. So I think the question for us to really think about is Because we're talking about setting the stage for what types of uses would be allowed where in our community is really your final question, I think is the biggest consideration, which is, is it appropriate to allow some of the space within this relatively small district to be utilized for a hotel purpose? And I think, it's been our recommendation that if the commission feels it's appropriate, that it does so in a way that's limited. But I think, and Charles can maybe speak to this a little bit more, these sites are large sites, and I think many of these sites could accommodate multiple buildings worth of development on them. So I don't think we're talking about a situation where a hotel may be the only thing that we would see resulting from the redevelopment of sites in this area. But I don't know if you want to offer anything else on that point, Charles.
No, that's true. In fact, the number of parcels that would be limited to just one building or so is quite small. They're mostly located on Sears Lane. The other thing to keep in mind is that developers do receive, or as the draft amendment proposes, a 0.25 FAR bonus for the inclusionary zoning provision, which again is not related to hotels, but that is just to say that if you're a developer and you're considering options to develop a property, you're going to get more in terms of development entitlement if you provide housing and therein receive that FAR bonus for the IZ provision. So that's something to keep in mind. As to whether or not that pushes a residential project over a hotel project in terms of, revenue creation and profitability for the developer, I can't say. But a 0.25 FAR bonus is fairly significant. I think on some of these larger properties, you're talking anywhere between, 50 to 150,000 square feet of development, which is sizable. So providing affordable housing vis-a-vis, inclusionary zoning would seem to benefit developers in many cases in a way that hotels would not.
Thank you. I just, this is a no-brainer, but it just seems to me that as soon as these projects are built and put up for sale, people will be Airbnb-ing them. It's just going to happen.
Well, I think
In residential buildings?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say that will never happen, because I know that some level of it will happen, but I do know one thing that we're working on providing an update to you on is the enforcement mechanism that the city is implementing to help us actually regulate short-term rentals according to the rules we just adopted. And you may remember that the policy that ultimately came out of the council process restricted short-term rentals in buildings of more than 4 units. So unless it's someone's, actual bona fide primary residence that they're using while they're not there, short-term rentals would be precluded from these multifamily developments.
That's great. Thanks, Megan.
And I think this is why I think we need to work to structure it, to formalize this demand that exists, and also I think about the, it was just a few years ago where housing folks were pretty adamantly against housing in this area. So, diversifying the uses, I think also has benefits in the long term, and maybe fits in the way that, if you're maybe right adjacent to, just say the railroad line, it's maybe more difficult to put residential there. Anyway, long story short, I sort of wonder, Charles, you have so much expertise in this, but if just kind of putting some sort of limitation as to the amount of usable space, that can be used for hospitality, whether it's, can be only a maximum of 85%, say, of the gross floor area. It might be a way to sort of, limits the economics. The chains aren't going to like that provision very much. So that sort of gets you more in the boutique range, and then either provides that space for amenity or residential or something else.
Can I ask a clarification question? So 85% gross floor area of any building or site?
I would think building,
Yeah,
because I think what that accomplishes is to still allow the use in a very sort of creative way. And then, you know, your sort of like garden inns aren't going to want to do that because it's just not their model, their box. And so, you know, it's probably not it's not going to be the first development that goes in, and that's probably not what you want, but down the line, as the economy changes or things in Burlington change, it allows that flexibility.
Any, Julia?
Yeah, I like that idea that you just raised, Michael. I also think, you know, if we do decide to go the route of these community benefits, that can be a sort of built-in barrier to, you know, large chains coming in, and also just I'm concerned about one hotel per parcel. That just sounds like a lot, but if they are limited in this way, that may, you know, just allow flexibility in terms of where they are placed in the district, but not actually lead to multiple hotels within the area, because I think probably we can all agree that, you know, 1 or 2 hotels would be more than sufficient if there are going to be any hotels in this area. Yeah, and I just want to go back to what Charles said earlier about the fact that this community benefit points analysis process took a year. And I wonder if other commissioners think that, you know, this is a critical issue that, you know, demands its own process. I'm not sure that I think that. But I think, you know, I love the thought that has been put into this in Asheville, and I think connecting it to affordable housing is so critical. And I like that they have, you know, made that clearly a priority in their ranking here. The other thing I want to add is I'm not sure. I have a question about whether some of these long-term artist stays can be considered a form of residential. Like, where is the line between that being a hotel stay and, like, you know, a hotel that has a benefit for this district because it's providing long-term artist space, whether that's, you know, residential or makerspace opportunities, and, you know, where is that residential? So that might be a distinction that, you know, comes through in the language of the amendment itself, but I don't know. I need a little guidance on that, I think.
Thanks. Charles, I don't know if you have any follow-up on what Julia was just saying?
Well, specifically the question about artist residences, I think that if you were to entertain that as a sort of type of community benefit or a sort of specific application of inclusionary zoning, I think it could be contemplated. I don't know. Again, determining, you know, what's the cost, what is the sort of relative cost of a unit to a developer? Would it pencil out for them? I'm not sure. We'd have to, I think, do a lot of engagement with the artist community and arts advocates to determine, you know, what exactly is the minimum amount of space that such a gallery or live work space would need to provide. Generator, for example, has artist studio spaces that are, 60 square feet. And that's obviously not enough to live in. So we'd have to, I think, calibrate that appropriately. But it is an interesting idea. And there are models for hotels that specifically house artists for many of the same reasons that I think you all are juggling today.
I'll just say for myself, I guess I'm still a little leery of the hotels in this area. We have a lot of other uses we're really trying to promote and to support there. And I'm just worried that hotels, a few things. One is that they could really take up a lot of the space that we're trying to use for other things that we've really prioritized above and beyond this. Also, just with some of the examples of the hotels that we've seen in the development process, they do generally take a very, very long time to develop. and have left places like the YMCA vacant for quite a while. I know there's been other hotels that have been planned for the city. Some happened, some didn't, some, there were bigger dreams for what happened than what they actually ended up being. They're just very complicated, I think, to develop. So I would want to be really careful that if we do allow them, to not let them take up a property and just have it sit there for years and years and years while it's trying to go through a process. It might be overly complicated. I do like the idea that if we're going to have the hotels there, that it's not just, limited to like one per lot, Charles, as you were saying, but Michael, your thought on saying the structure itself, the building itself that houses the hotel needs to be more of a mixed use. Personally, I think 85% for the hotel for me is, would be too much. I'd like to see it more of a balance, but if we did something like that, I think that's a possible way of making it work and staying compatible with what our overall goals are. I also like, Charles, the way that this community has done, this other community has done the community benefits thing. But I am aware that if we go that route, it will take a long time to put that together. I guess with that, is there a reason that we can't separate this out, the hotel aspect out from the overall change that we're doing to the south end, to this part, and say, let's focus on that as a more singular idea once we've done the more broader rezoning for this area?
Can I add something to that, Andy? Because
Yeah.
I think something you said and something Julia said sort of jogged some additional thoughts I had on this, but hadn't communicated. So one of the things that we heard when this first came up, over a year ago, was an idea to have some shared living space, sort of communal living space, for lack of a better term. That sort of is a genre buster, if you will, in terms of residential versus dorm versus something else. I hate to use dorm because I know that's such a loaded term in Burlington, but it's communal living of one type or another. And so I think the question is, okay, if you want to go forward with something that, like, what does that look like? If you don't have a kitchen in the unit, if you have certain amenities that are shared, if you have a flexible arrangement with the amount of time that you reside in that place, does that start to look like a multifamily unit, or does that start to look like a hotel? I mean, hotel, I think, is almost the wrong word in some ways. Similarly, to Julia's point, if you have artist residency or innovation residency, if you will, where does that person go? And then does this, what is intended to be a fairly creative place, allow that flexibility? So these are the types of use cases that I don't even think we've thought of all of them. I think when you think hotel, you think like hotel in a parking lot that has a continental breakfast. And I don't think that's really what I'm trying to promote here. So I think it's extremely limited. And I think it just provides another lever to pull in terms of the creativity of the district and its vibrancy. So, even if it made people comfortable, say 80% is hotel, 20% is not a gross floor area, plus it's limited to the parcel. So I don't even think we should use the plural. I think it should be in the singular, but I just think having that option over the 15 to 20 years that this place is going to develop might have some benefit.
Do you want to speak to this issue of like how artist residence and long-term stay has come up? Charles, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to? I think it's worth us talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, you said a couple of things, Michael, that did raise a couple of points that we have not talked about. Advocates for let's hotels or hospitality of some sort have said that in terms of business recruitment, it's important to have a place for people to stay. And just remember that, any lease that is at least 1 month is just considered essentially a typical regular dwelling unit. So if a developer comes in is attached to a business who wants to promote recruitment in some way, they can provide 1-month leases and satisfy that demand.
Same with
Um,
artist residency. I think that is really important to that question you raised, Julie.
Yeah, with artist residency as well, that's true. Co-housing is also a new use that we are proposing should be permitted without any limitations in the district. And we have taken a first stab at drafting a definition for co-housing. I think we need to finesse it a little bit, figure out how consistent it is with the city's definition of a dwelling unit. But essentially what we're trying to permit is essentially what you just said, Michael, a type of residence in which perhaps there's not a kitchen provided for every unit. Perhaps there's a communal kitchen or some other communal space that is shared among residents of individual, let's not call them units, let's call them rooms or dwellings. And that would be a permitted use. So once we, firm up a definition, and we can look at that definition tonight, I think you might feel comfortable that that is achieving this goal.
Well, as an aside, I think going in that route, just generally of the co-housing and those other housing options, I think is going to be both exciting and crucial to the work that we're doing going forward in the missing middle and all that other stuff we're doing. So I think that's
Yes.
great. You're looking at that.
And the only thing I just wanted to add to what Charles said is I think the reason why we have been coming back to thinking about hotels maybe in a more traditional sense is just because kind of what's left from the variety of options that we've talked about is why we might want to allow hotels is truly the pure kind of hotel model. And certainly in our ordinance, actually, our ordinance was just amended by our short-term rental changes, but we're really talking about lodging, like pure lodging at this point, which is defined as, a place that has all the sort of typical guest services. And so, individual rooms for lead and all the typical guest services. So any of those other kind of innovative models that as long as they're occupied by the same person for 30 days or more are just going to fall under housing in our ordinance.
Alex, did you have your hand raised?
I was just gonna suggest, I agree with what you said, with that maybe we should make this a separate component from what we're discussing, and that, we should find, Megan, in the planning department, the funds to hire another planner for a year to work on the community benefit portion, because holy cow.
I think we decide. I think we decide now, or it just dies, and that's fine. I don't think we need to study it.
I think the other thing I was going to offer, I agree with Michael. I think if you decide that you don't want to move forward with hotels tonight, I think certainly we're going to have more work to do looking at the rest of the enterprise district and fine tuning and making some changes to what's allowable where throughout the rest of the district. So it's possible we could come back to that. I don't think that we're at the stage where this needs to rise to the level of being kind of a separate standalone issue. I do think if you like the concept of community benefits, there's a streamlined way that we can approach this. And Charles really wrote this in the memo that was in your agenda. Is like, we're sharing this example from Asheville, but I think the concept came up in a really simple form from our discussion last meeting, raised by Michael, that just maybe we say that 80% gross floor area limit is allowed when the other 20% is artist space, or is, you could define kind of a group of uses that you would prefer be in that 20% balance of the building, whether it's childcare or artist residences, artist, workspace, whatever the case may be. I think you could take a very simple approach in the context of this amendment if it's something you like. But if you feel like it would be kind of just throwing darts out there and seeing what sticks, we could move on and say hotels are not permitted. So I think it's up to you.
I wasn't entirely serious about the spending a year.
So
Um,
maybe, well, Andy, I don't want to.
No, go ahead. I was just.
Yeah,
gonna
I was
ask-
just gonna say, maybe we take whatever 15-20% in one per parcel and we allow the full commission a chance to review it. Understanding that trying to get too cute with it is gonna take a lot of time.
Yeah, I'm fine with something like that. Just move
Yeah, we
forward,
can-
you
we can-
limit it, move forward, and we could figure it out still before we're done with this.
All right, we'll bring some language for your next meeting.
Let me just check though with Alex and Julia, if that makes
That's
sense to
great.
you as well.
That's great.
Absolutely.
All right. Moving along, so residential uses. So again, the question here is, should residential uses be permitted anywhere? Should they be permitted only in new buildings? There's also been a suggestion that residential uses should be permitted as additions to existing buildings, so not in the existing buildings themselves, but in additions. So I think that's the question here, and in some ways, the discussion is similar as with hotels. I think that there are existing buildings in the district that one could very easily see being converted to residential use, and that goes for small sort of one-story buildings along Pine Street or Sears Lane up to buildings that are taller, you know, the Innovation Center being one. It's a, you know, typical building where loft apartments can be imagined. So I think that is the question as to, you know, where should residential uses be permitted? I think it is staff's, you know, I think we recommend that there should be some limitation, I think. I think we've recommended up till now that residential uses should only be permitted in new buildings, that those that do not exist at the time of adoption of the amendment.
Well, let me just weigh in briefly on this and hear from the others. You know, I'm, on the one hand, you know, I'm open to seeing new housing go anywhere within the district. On the other hand, I want to make sure it's balanced where we continue to have all the other uses and promote all the other uses and support the other uses, the artist space, the maker space, all of those things. And, you know, given the housing market today, one can easily imagine that housing would just take over all of those spaces because, you know, they could probably update them and get more rent for them. So the way that you've come up with to say you can only put residential in new structures, new buildings, creates sort of that a way of protecting the maker space, protecting the artist space, protecting that other space while allowing housing to happen. So it creates a balance in that way. And so in that sense, I like that. But if there are other ways of creating that balance to create the protection for the uses, the other kinds of uses that we really want to promote there and support there, I'm open to other ways of doing it as well. Again, what you've come up with is a really clean way of doing it. But there may be other ways to do that also. My biggest concern is just making sure that we protect the other uses that we want to promote there. Michael?
Question for Charles on the additions. Do you think there's value there? Or there will be enough space? I guess the buildings are within larger parcels, so they'll have the opportunity to add density. Is that sort of the thinking there?
Yeah, I think, you know, we've heard from folks here internally that there has been interest, and I don't know if they've looked into the structural feasibility of doing this, but adding floors to existing buildings where there's not space to move laterally. That is one option. Yeah, I think that's what we're
For
speaking
what
about.
purpose, Charles?
for residential uses. So you might imagine there's an existing building that's, let's say, got artist studios and, you know, there's a desire to put some apartments above that. Obviously, again, structural feasibility would have to be determined, and it could very well be that that is not feasible on many of these buildings. Not able to say that at this time. So, yeah.
And I think the other thing that this offers is the flexibility that on sites with buildings, where maybe developing on top of them is not feasible. A lot of them do have pretty large land area. So you could imagine that through this provision, housing could be allowed in either kind of freestanding new buildings on the same site as existing buildings, or if someone did actually want to provide an addition on the side or back of an existing building, this could allow that as well.
So it's a commercial ADU. I'm just kidding.
In the multifamily sense, right?
I agree with Andy on this. I think it's really clean and achieves a lot of objectives. I like the ability to add density, which is kind of what we're talking about here generally. For the residential use, that is.
Julia?
Yeah, I agree. I like the approach to this. And I'm curious whether, you know, are there certain buildings where this would work and not work? I think maybe we alluded to that just a bit earlier, but you know, in what situation will this create kind of a funky relationship between like a very small like parent structure and then like a very large accessory structure or like addition? You know, I understand, you know, we might not have like a detailed look at any of that right now, but I'm just curious like how that might play out in terms of non-conforming structures in the area, and you know, whether they're like, are the incentives there for a total redevelopment if someone really is wanting to have substantial residential in their area. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to make sure that we are inclusive of some of the uses that are already there that meet the intents of the district. So.
Oh, last thing in this, what I think this addition, the residential addition allows is, I think it helps mitigate some of the risks that you're gonna have tear downs for the purpose of creating residential also, which I think is a nice add.
Wouldn't that be not permitted though? Because their buildings aren't existing? Like, would you be allowed to tear down?
You would, and that is a risk of only allowing residential uses in existing buildings.
And we,
Of only allowing it in new buildings.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how
can we
you
do
mitigate
something
that?
about that to mitigate that risk? You know, to say you can't tear down a building for residential, you know, some number of years between when you tear it down and when you could put in residential, although we don't want to create empty lots either, so.
I'm not, Megan, are you aware of any? I
know I'm trying to think, I mean, the closest thing that I can think of in our ordinance is not a commercial provision. It's actually a residential provision, in that we have the housing replacement ordinance. If you know, tear down and eliminate residential dwelling units in the city, you have to provide them elsewhere or pay into the housing trust fund. You know, we've talked about the fact that in many cases we could envision a future where some of these models we've used for the preservation and affordability of housing in the city could also be applicable to commercial uses. So that would be a really novel approach that I would have to think more about in terms of doing that. But I think, to Charles and Michael's point, the goal here, two of the ways that we were trying to kind of prevent the total demolition or loss of commercial space was by promoting and really incentivizing new developments on the same site along with these buildings, as well as providing some flexibility through this addition provision. So housing could be incorporated as part of kind of a modification to existing buildings rather than a total replacement of. But yeah, I think in terms of preventing tear downs and replacements, I would have to think some more about that on the whole, but.
So we need a commercial replacement ordinance. I can think of a lot of old buildings on Pine Street and the intersecting streets that would be ripe for tear down. You know, stuff that is not, I'm not talking about the Maltex building, but a bunch of other shed-like commercial buildings that, I mean, just looking at your second bullet here, existing buildings, you know, the proposal is preserve artist, maker, and office space. Like that's, you know, think about the way the South End has developed. Like, you know, even when I moved here 18 years ago, you know, the Art Hop was a example of a really thriving, amazing, you know, culture that grew up, you know, with what very little what they have there. There's, you know, there's not a lot of, it's not a huge community, but it's pretty fantastic. So, you know, we need to try to not harm that to the extent that we can.
Well, just a quick reminder about the location of this district. And I don't know if you want to go back to the map, Charles. Maybe we could walk through what's on the parcels that are proposed to be in this district right now.
Okay. Yes. So, Alex, to your point, if you look at the map, there's, you know, I can conceivably think of a couple buildings. Let's count them, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings that very well could be candidates for tear down. You know, the older dealer.com building that is on the northwest corner of the Innovation Center lot is one. And then there's 3 buildings on Sears Lane, actually one of which may be already in the crosshairs of the Parkway. I'd have to check on that. And then this building, Generator, on Sears Lane. The rest of the district is, you know, there's the BED building, there's the Department of Public Works building at Lakeside and Pine.
Mhm.
You know, likely not going to be torn down for housing, let's say. The Innovation Center, I think, is the real question mark here. Given the amount of land, though, on that property, one would think that if a developer was contemplating a project there, that, you know, taking on the cost of demolishing that building is not going to be their first priority. It's not
going anywhere.
It's not the lowest hanging fruit. So we're really talking about a handful of 1, maybe 2-story, I think mostly 1-story buildings that could be in the crosshairs of tear downs. So I think that's really the question here.
Thanks, Charles.
Yeah.
Because of the way you've drawn this.
Yeah, and that's been a big part of the intent here is to, you know, before we brought this concept to talk to you about again, you know, we had a lot of conversations with folks about the tolerance for these boundaries and whether certain buildings should be in for the purpose of helping encourage their future reuse and opportunity to add vibrancy to this district versus the concern about taking them out of the potential commercial kind of portfolio of space in this district. And so these boundaries have been intentionally very limited to try to focus almost exclusively on properties where we see new development really being the priority versus the replacement of anything that's happening, and really have few spaces that are occupied by artists. I'll say, in terms of the discussion about the properties on Sears Lane and the inclusion of Generator and the properties across the street, we have talked with the director of the Generator, and they're on board with including these properties in the district. And actually, I think it was through some conversations with her and some other stakeholders in the neighborhood that we even ended up including the properties on the south side of Sears Lane, where that maybe hadn't originally been part of our discussion. So I think that the way these boundaries have been drawn help us to mitigate the risk of loss of really thriving artist spaces today.
Thank you.
You know, I think that's a really good point. Thanks for reminding us of that. Any other questions, concerns, comments on this one? So if I'm not mistaken, the place that people are going towards is what Charles and Megan are proposing, which is keep existing buildings more or less as they are, allow housing for new development, including new development on lots that may have another building on. Is that, did I say that correctly?
Or on top of those buildings.
Or on top of those buildings, yes.
Yeah, in
Physically connected to, right, either vertically or laterally, yeah.
Which I think is all of what you've suggested or recommended.
Yes,
So I think what we're saying is yes to your recommendation,
great.
unless somebody thinks otherwise, but I think that's what I was hearing.
Sorry, realizing that that's not exactly how this slide reads, but yes, I think
It
we
is
got that.
not,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Thanks for clarifying that, Megan.
Close enough.
Yes, we will bring that language back for you next time. Building height is the next issue. And so on your screen, you're seeing the specific height area map for the downtown form code. And remember, height is regulated downtown essentially based on your location and the street upon which your property is located. We don't have the benefit, as we discussed last time, of having an established street network. So it's more difficult to contemplate an exact sort of replica or model in the South End. But we can bring forward some concepts that are based on that specific height map model. And these are two of them. I don't think these are inclusive of the entire universe of options here, but I think these are two that we would recommend based on some conversations that you all have had and that we've had with stakeholders and with the community and with our colleagues in the city. So concept A here on the right essentially tries to limit height in a few locations while allowing the maximum up to 85 feet in more locations. And so specifically the waterfront property that is located west of the rail corridor, it's traditionally been the city's practice to limit height directly adjacent to the waterfront. And it's our recommendation that that practice should be continued in the Innovation District. The second area where height we feel should be limited is directly east and adjacent to the rail corridor, primarily to limit any potential impacts of height and shade on the lakeside neighborhood. And then Sears Lane and Pine Street are two existing streets in the district that are adjacent to other districts where we feel that given existing character, particularly along Pine Street, it's appropriate to keep buildings at 45 feet. Granted, 45 feet along Pine Street would make those buildings among the tallest, if not the tallest, until you get right into downtown. But in the remainder, in this concept A, in those areas in red, you would be able to develop up to 85 feet. Emily last time, raised a point about, well, maybe height should be located in the interior of lots. And so concept B is sort of an answer to that. It's a bit of a hybrid of that approach with concept A. The difference here is that height would be limited more along the edges of the barge canal properties in a similar way that we feel like height should be limited against Lakeside's neighborhood. The barge canal should be another area where it's appropriate to limit height. That said, 85 feet, eight stories is essentially double what one is allowed to do today in the district, and combined with the floor area ratio standard that we're proposing, and we have calibrated that down actually, which we want to discuss with you. We feel like this gets, this would allow developers in the city to see the type of housing supply that is the objective here. So thoughts on these maps, other strategies. Essentially, the way we could do this is, for now, we would say we could provide a buffer on a map based on property lines or street center lines or railroad center lines.
Awesome, folks. Alex?
Thank you. Just, I'm in full agreement with Emily's statement the last meeting about how 6 stories provides a sense of connection to the street for the residents, and for people on the street, it's not something that's so, towering over them like a canyon, and that once you get above that, you lose that sense. That's my thought.
Anyone else?
Could you, Alex, could you say a little bit more about that in terms of, it's a little hard to see on here, but I think that the way this is illustrated, the blue would be limited to 45 feet, which is the existing height limit today in the district.
Yep.
And then the red is the potential to allow up to 85 feet. So understanding that, is there a specific area that you're concerned with in terms of the allowance for up to 85 feet?
No, it was a general comment about
Okay.
the effect of 8 stories on the person on the street. What is the dotted line in the center, the lower half?
That
that-
is Champlain Parkway.
Thank you.
Just- yeah.
Julia?
Yeah, so with the Champlain Parkway there, I'm interested in others' thoughts on, any potential new, a new street network and how height limits would interact with that. I think, there are multiple ways where that could be really successful in different, I think different designs could be successful with that. I don't know that I have a particular preference between these two maps at the moment, but I do like the idea of that buffer from the railway and from Barge Canal as something to move forward with, and Lakeside as something to move forward with for now.
And I
Yeah.
think both of these do that, don't they?
Yes, yes. Just a reminder, the rationale behind allowing 8-story buildings along the parkway is to use taller buildings as a mitigating factor against noise pollution and air pollution primarily that is likely to come from the parkway. Taller buildings along heavily trafficked roads can intercept noise and air pollution in a way that it protects the interior of the district from those types of pollution and then from those sources of pollution. And so that's the rationale there. There's definitely an opportunity to provide more granularity here. To Alex's point, if you'd like to limit, certain areas to 6 stories, that's certainly something we can do. It's fairly easy to use proximity buffers. Here we're showing 200 feet, but there's no reason we couldn't say, within 100 feet of the parkway, you're allowed up to 8 stories, but in that intervening space between the 200 foot or the 4-story buffer and the 8-story buffer, you're allowed 6 stories.
Michael?
I think the other, I was just going to add one other consideration is also that there could be, setback requirements above a certain height. So instead of saying, 8 stories would be completely prohibited within a certain distance of a road. It could be that, after 6 stories, maybe you set the remaining stories back by 10 feet or something, which is an approach we've taken in other parts of our ordinance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
that
we
would
all,
work.
in a similar fashion, remember, there is a floor plate limitation on floors 7 and 8. Essentially for floors 1 through 6, one is allowed to build a floor plate of 15,000 square feet, but once you get to 7 and 8, you have to shrink that down to 10,000 square feet. It works in a similar way to step back, but doesn't really prescribe, where it has to happen. It just says it's going to happen somewhere if you're limiting the floor plate. The caveat being we remove that limitation if the building meets green building performance standards identical to those in the form code, or if the building is built out of mass timber. So it's a way to try and induce, more sustainable forms of construction.
Great.
Michael, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I had 2 questions. The first is like, why were you guys thinking, I forget if I asked this last time, I apologize. Why are we thinking 8 stories? Just because, what's the rationale? I suppose limitations of the timber frame, basically, and thinking that those are just where the construction economics are. I guess yeah, related question, within limited space, why not higher? I don't know. I'm saying I agree with that. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, for one, we didn't entertain taller buildings than 8 stories with the community. I think that was the highest sort of we went. There was general, I think, comfort, at least in the engagement we did in our public meetings, with 8 stories. In talking about taller buildings, we didn't really contemplate that. I will say that 8 stories, another rationale there is related to mass timber construction, at least in small part it owes to mass timber. So today the building code that we use here in Vermont and Burlington allows 6 stories of mass timber construction. And so one could construct a building that has a podium of concrete or steel and then put 6 stories of mass timber above that. The new 2021 building code that, as I understand it, Vermont is going to adopt sometime in the future, allows much taller mass timber buildings, anywhere from 9 to 18 stories, depending on very specific types of construction. But to answer your question, we didn't even ask questions about that with the community, so it's just not something we've discussed. Given though the very low lying character of the existing fabric, it could be seen as very much out of character.
I think
Yeah,
the other thing I'll just say is, we're talking about properties that are the size of multiple blocks if they were in the downtown, for example. So just having much larger development area than, say, the redevelopment of a downtown block. And I was just pulling up just to double check, at 85 feet, that would be the second highest building height limit that we have anywhere in the city. It's consistent with a height limit that we're talking about for the back portion of Trinity campus, kind of away from Colchester Avenue. So kind of thinking about how we consistently think about different scales of building height that we allow throughout Burlington, with the tallest buildings allowed in the central core of the downtown.
Okay. Related follow-up question, and I was like playing around on Google Earth, not very well, but do we know what the kind of like view shed is of, say, like an 8-story building?
What shed?
Like where we can see if it's 8 stories here, and I'm
Got it.
say like in Callahan Park in the winter, do I see it?
Yeah,
just kinda curious.
Michael, I want to say early on, I did this analysis, and I can bring this back for the next meeting. I want to say I went back to Alder Lane, Linton Terrace, and back to Shelburne Road. And I think I want to say if I'm standing at the intersection of Cherry Lane and Linden Terrace, I could see over an 8-story building. Again, let me bring that back to you to confirm, but it typically wouldn't have, I would say, an inordinate impact on that view shed, especially considering the floor plate limitation to 15,000
Right.
square feet.
Right. No, I really, I mean, I like the 8 stories. I think that's a great, sort of great argument, you know, I think that supports your argument very well, and that, you know, you're protecting views and that kind of thing up the hill.
Charles, do you need to have a preference from us? Like whether it's the left one or the right one?
Ideally, yes.
else?
I think the key question between these two concepts is the barge canal worthy of limiting height down to 4 stories? Or on those properties, you know, the Innovation Center and those properties on Pine Street that back up to the barge canal, are you comfortable allowing 8 stories on the entirety of those properties adjacent to the canal? It sounds like you're set on the 45-foot limitation along the rail corridor and Lakeside neighborhood.
Alex?
I have a question. So what I was wondering is, on the northern half, opposite the Hula property, so on the east side of the rail line, why is that limited to 45?
You know, consistency with the south of Lakeside, understanding that it's not a residential neighborhood, but
Like, what's special about the rail line?
nothing is special about the rail line, but you are getting fairly close to the waterfront, especially at the northern end of the Innovation Center
Okay.
property. So for the same reason that we would propose to keep height at 45 feet west of the rail there, we would want to limit it east of the rail.
It's also pretty narrow on the bike path right there, Alex. It could feel pretty intimidating. I generally like the height, but there I
Yeah.
agree with that.
I mean, if there's anywhere you'd want more height, it would be on the barge canal property in the northern part of this, you know, that sliver there on the left-hand side. Because, I mean, I think Eves laid out, was it several months ago, the challenge of developing that site, like putting in pilings and floating essentially the entire structure on pilings, you know?
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that.
So
So
you're
you're-
saying that that would give you more of a preference for the map on the left than on the right? Am I understanding you correctly?
Or you want to allow up to 8 stories directly east of the rail corridor on the Innovation Center property, right?
Saying like the one east of the barge canal itself.
Oh.
That one,
Oh,
that's
oh.
the property that needs the most flexibility of.
Are you looking, Alex, are you looking at the map on the left?
Yep.
Yeah, I'd go along with that one. Others? How are others on this? Michael, Julia?
I'm undercutting my own argument in favor of economic feasibility.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So would you say that where my cursor is, where it's blue, you would like that to be red? So
No.
Okay.
No.
No, I think he's saying that map is a good map.
Okay. Got it.
The preference between the two maps, that's the preference one.
Great.
I think is what you're saying now, Alex.
I would rather it all be 6 stories, but okay.
I think some of it may end up being, probably a good portion of it may end up being 6 stories. You know, I think 8 is an upper limit, but I think it was Eves a few weeks ago who said that, you know, it's common that, you know, these upper limits are not reached.
That's right.
So I think it's probably pretty likely that there will be, you know, a healthy amount of variation in these heights, which is, you know, just nice from a aesthetic perspective, and a pedestrian perspective. I think I'm also favoring the map on the left because I think it allows greater flexibility, not only for that tricky site, but also for different configurations of, you know, new street patterns. I think the one on the right, while you could have a variety of street patterns with different building heights there, it kind of does lend itself to a centrally focused street pattern. So I just think the one on the left, given that it's just an upper limit for that height limit, not a prescription, it might increase the flexibility there.
I think
Okay.
to that point too, I did want to share, you probably have seen this in the summary materials from the public engagement, but Charles provided pictures of and models of buildings that were, primarily, fully built out blocks with just 4 stories, with 6 stories, with 8 stories, and then with a mix, and people strongly favored the mix. So I think the idea of having these different height areas with some pretty wide degree of variability between the maximum heights in these 2 areas, paired with some of the other stuff that he'll talk about here in just a minute, to Julia's point, can help facilitate a range of options.
I
Can,
like the mix.
can someone remind me of the barge canal plan for the non-developable area? There's an idea that it's a park. Will it be a space that people can experience? Or do people need to stay off that?
Well, public access is limited today. There's obviously varying opinions about how that should play out, but I think a long-term goal is to see continued conservation of the site and more formalized public access, the degree of which I think is to be determined.
I think it would be everything that we've talked about to this point in city plans has been about low impact public access. So not developed like a Callahan Park with sports fields, but maybe some, boardwalks or something that could allow for the renaturalization of the land with some public enjoyment, but not overly formalized or developed public access.
Yeah, and recall that the development of the innovation district is likely to actually help with the conservation and the remediation of the barge canal, in the fact that there will be fewer impervious surfaces and that green stormwater infrastructure will be required or strongly incentivized in the development. And so it's likely that post-development, the waters in the barge canal could actually be cleaner, healthier temperature than they are today.
Okay, thanks. I was just trying to think about how this all, what the experience will be.
I think winter uses are really exciting for the barge canal. Just as a side note, I think, as a, I don't know, Oak Ledge is not as an inviting of a place in the winter as maybe the barge canal could be, given that it's a bit protected with that rail corridor. So just a side note there.
Michael, do you have a reservation about how this map is oriented, given that?
Well, I'm feeling like I'm betraying myself or something. Well, I was just wondering about, like, from the parks perspective, or the barge canal, or not the parks, but the low impact, if we think this is going to be like a space that people will be in, and then, like, obviously, like, if you've been in like a Central Park or Cheeseman Park in Denver or something, there's like big towers right above you. And like, I generally am in favor of the density, but here I find myself a little bit reserved. So I don't know that I have a final opinion, I guess, is the conclusion. If the barge canal, despite its hazards, will be an allowable space for people to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the long-term interest. How soon that remediation work happens, I think, is to be determined, but it's definitely the long-term kind of vision for that from Plan BTD South End in particular.
I mean, to Michael's point, there's kind of 2 parts of Callahan Park. There's like, or 3 parts. There's like an upper field and a lower field. And, if you were in the lower field, you would definitely get some blocked sun in the afternoon. Because it's, you know, it's not much higher than the elevation. It is fairly low there in that lower field.
Yeah, I think, I think Charles has the ability to maybe look at some models of these different building heights and projections around shadows. So that's maybe something, if you wanted to see a little bit more, we could share with you. I mean, I think the other thing is hearing a couple balanced considerations about providing the economic feasibility of redeveloping some difficult to develop sites, or creating buffers, but not kind of precluding areas of diversified building height. As Charles mentioned before, these setbacks, these lines here are really just kind of an initial take. So
Oh, yeah.
these are 200 feet. They could be, as Charles mentioned, they could be 100 feet. They could be something different. So if you would like us to play around with how to find some balance between those concepts in a more fine-grained way, it's something that we could definitely come back to you with.
Site visit in the rain is the only way to go.
The only kind of site visit
Onto
we do.
property that we're not allowed to walk on.
You have to go into the barge canal to find
Right.
out.
With the 200 feet, there is a rationale there, and that is that, and we've talked about block structures and dimensions of blocks, and I think 200 feet is the very minimum of a block that I think we would want to see here, and so that's the relationship there. But yeah, otherwise, there's no reason these buffers couldn't be bigger or smaller.
And what's a typical city block in downtown Burlington? 400?
400 by 400.
Cool.
Yeah. All right.
Speaking of city blocks.
Yes.
that's a
We've
topic of discussion.
so just I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, but the recommendation initially was an FAR, floor area ratio, of 2.5. We've thought more about that, especially given the inclusionary zoning density bonus of what we're proposing is 0.25. Most other districts, the IZ bonus gets you a 0.5 FAR and an additional floor of height. We're intentionally being less conservative about the bonus here related to IZ, but still recommending a bonus of 0.25. So we're actually, in the draft amendment, have lowered the recommended FAR to 2 or 2.25, which would allow a maximum achievable FAR of 2.5. I know this doesn't mean much to you unless you're looking at some models. So this is a model, probably pretty ambitious model that includes a very large amount of office space, probably more than what we can expect to see in the short term at least. So close to 500 units. And again, this is assuming a healthy breakdown of unit types between 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. And it may actually be that 90% of the units are 1 bedroom, so the unit count could go up. But the statistics are here. If you drop that down to 2.25, you're essentially losing 75,000 square feet on this site alone. So again, this is all to say that we feel very comfortable that a 2.25 FAR with the inclusionary zoning bonus of 0.25 up to 2.5 is, facilitates the kind of development that I think we all expect to see and that property owners in the community would like to see in terms of housing supply. So that's something we feel comfortable about. If you want to have a discussion about FAR, happy to have that, but that's the recommendation now, 2.25.
What's the, sorry, I know we have the 15% requirement in the overlay. What do you need to get you that extra bonus?
Nothing.
Oh,
It's
nothing.
by
You just have
right.
to.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you do 15%, you get the quarter.
That's right.
Okay, so there's not a minimum IZ then?
That is, the minimum IZ is 15%. This is a change that we made to how our IZ standards work when we reformed the whole article a couple of years ago. We made all of the bonuses for development intensity by right. So they're just an acknowledgement that you may need a bigger envelope in order to accommodate your required IZ.
I
If
feel
that
like
makes
I'm
sense.
missing something. So you're required to do 15% though.
Yes, you're required to do 15%. And in order to help facilitate implementation of that requirement, you are entitled to a 0.25 FAR bonus.
Oh, okay. So basically, if you do a residential project, you get the
Yeah,
0.25. Okay, I
Yes.
get it. Thank you.
yes.
Yeah, it's how all the any bonuses in terms of the development intensity that are enabled in other zoning districts as well, it's how they all work. It's just entitled by right.
Got it.
Charles, I think this looks fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm glad because I do want to have a discussion about blocks and streets. So
What does the other planner think? Excuse me, Charles.
I'm in support of the 2.25. I think the question came up last time about just how do we layer all of these pieces together on top of each other? And I think this is just coming back to and more closely calibrating what we think could happen on these sites when you put all these standards together, and also allow for kind of an achievable amount of development in these areas.
Thank you.
Assuming you meant me and not one of the other planners that are.
Well, there is another.
There are others, yeah.
I think it looks great too.
Thank you.
So yes, the next issue is blocks and streets. So recall that we obviously have some very large sites that do not have internal street networks. And so that's been a key question for us. And we have coalesced around a proposal of requiring a block perimeter standard, which is essentially establishing a minimum distance around any block, therein requiring the provision of new streets. We also want to say that a block does not have to be bounded by streets accessible to cars. One could, as we're recommending it, achieve a block through the provision of, let's say, if you've got 4 streets, 1 street and 3 multi-use paths to create a block. So recall last time we showed you this map, which is, overlaying a very simple square grid, 400 by 400, and then making adjustments to fit within the properties. Actually, in thinking a bit more about it, and speaking with stakeholders and just looking at the likely development of sites, have sort of coalesced around 2 concepts, and there's a third that we can talk about as well. So concept A here is a minimum block perimeter of 1,600 feet. Again, the creation of which could be achieved through streets. It could be achieved through multi-use paths. So let's take the Innovation Center property as an example. A 1,600-foot block perimeter, say they could build a block fully bounded by streets surrounding the existing Innovation Center building, and then 2 more blocks with a perimeter of 1,600 feet. But the western block is actually bounded on the western side and the northern side by a multi-use path that one could see tying into a future barge canal boardwalk, could see tying into Electric Avenue, which comes out to Pine Street here. It's not a formal road today, but could be in the future. Likewise, if you go down the property to the south, 125 Lakeside and 68 Sears Lane, you can imagine 2 1,600-foot blocks with a multi-use path on the west side and the southern side with a street running through the middle accessible to cars. We understand this is a bit of a nuance for now, at least for the next 5 years, that given the limited access character of Champlain Parkway, you're not actually able to achieve the full connection of a street to the parkway. There's no intersections allowed, at least for the next 5 years and maybe forever. So we want to be clear to folks who are coming in and creating blocks along the parkway that if you connect a multi-use path around the corner to a multi-use path along the parkway, that would achieve your block, even if the street is not, technically connecting. Should also say that in either of these scenarios, we have the city engineer has a typical street section, or actually not street section, dimension of 66 feet that would be required for dedication of public streets. For public multi-use paths, the minimum dedication is 15 feet, which is identical to what the bike path is today. It allows for a paved 11-foot path with a shoulder on the bike path. It's obviously crushed stone or brick, but that would be the minimum. So again, this would allow a lot of flexibility, would encourage a high degree of walkability and bikeability. Concept B is more removed, I think, from traditional block perimeter standards. So it actually creates distinctions between streets for cars and streets for multi-use or other modes of transportation. So this would be a 2,400-foot block perimeter and an 800-foot perimeter for multi-use paths. And so you can see how that sort of breaks down. You get a much finer grained network, and they wouldn't have to be sort of orthogonal blocks like this. They could be curved streets, they could be diagonals. This is just for ease of representation here, but essentially, Michael, you're getting something like the Pearl District block scale at a multi-use path level, while the streets are actually allowed to be two encircle blocks that are much bigger. So these dashed lines would be streets accessible to cars. Everything in solid blue would be a multi-use path. So those are two concepts. And speaking with colleagues from DPW, I think there's a third concept that we could recommend that says 2,400 feet for blocks bounded by cars, 1,600 feet for blocks bounded by bike paths, and then 800 feet for blocks bounded by publicly accessible pedestrian ways, which would get you, I think, a high degree of block granularity for pedestrians and something more akin to what is, I think, comfortable and desirable for cyclists. And then with cars, I think 2,400 feet would allow, in this district, given the existing conditions, a good degree of connectivity for folks in cars.
What are the potential developer stakeholders say? I mean, I look at the like B and I'm like, oh, that like makes sense to me because that's, I don't know, it has a certain, if you're like in this kind of thing, that has a certain aesthetic to it. But like, what do the developers say?
The developers we've spoken to are happy about, I think, either of these concepts. I think the vision that they're seeing is highly pedestrian. We've heard advocacy for curbless streets, that sort of thing, very sort of mixed traffic character streets. Woonerfs is a term that's thrown around a lot, coming from the Netherlands. But essentially, this would allow the flexibility to achieve any type of sort of street that you would want. So in talking to developers, either one of these, I think, have met their vision, I would say.
Anyone else? Julia?
So with the Woonerf, I was gonna ask if you had looked at Woonerfs because they're so cool. But is the street plus path in concept B, is that a separated path, or is that?
It could
okay.
be. It doesn't have to be. It could be. This allows that flexibility. I should say that there is a pathway for exceptions to that typical 66-foot street, and the city engineer can actually make that exception. So that is, I would say, you know, a price worth paying for a developer who's trying to achieve something different and, let's say, innovative here as far as transportation and streets goes. Yeah.
I mean, it would be really cool as a compliment to Church Street to have that type of environment here.
And that's exactly what we've heard from developers, is that kind of very pedestrian character, very limited access for emergency vehicles, for service vehicles, that sort of thing. I think that's the vision, especially given that the Champlain Parkway is going to be bounding this district on the east side. I think there's a strong desire to balance that with a much more pedestrian and cyclist friendly character in the interior.
Yep.
Anyone else?
My question is, how do you get that desired result of the Wooner versus, you know, with if you have too much flexibility, then, you know, you might not get what the desired result.
Well, the one way, I mean, we can't require that we're going to get that, but if you do decide you want to, you know, something like concept B that has this very fine-grained pedestrian network, you're guaranteed to get, you know, a good number of pedestrian paths. But I suppose, you know, we have entertained the idea of a new sort of street section that would be required, but I think similar to the hotel issue, that probably takes a bit of study time that we haven't really contemplated yet. So yeah, I know that's not the answer you wanted to hear.
No, I mean, it's just, the part of this is like you're envisioning an entire new neighborhood, and that, you know, you could get something other than the 1950s version of the American suburb that is really compelling. And like, you know, I just don't want that to be squandered, but I don't think that it will, but
Yeah.
you never know.
You know, I think you're right, Alex. One of the things you have to be careful of, to not just duplicate something that we already have when, I mean, in an area like this, there is a lot of flexibility. It's to not be too rigid, like on some of the requirements. Let there be some flexibility, put guidelines in, but put benchmarks or whatever it is in, but let the developers be flexible on how they actually accomplish some of this, so they can be creative.
Okay,
They'll think of things that we're not anywhere close to thinking about right now.
as long as they are actually creative.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that's what I was gonna say too, is, you know, we're trying to find the right balance between giving like, this image is kind of appropriate for the analogy. Like, we're trying to put the grid lines down on paper and say, like, this is generally how we want you to do this stuff, without overly prescribing exactly what it means and where. Understood that kind of point. And I think rather than just saying, like, sure, develop these sites in any way you want. I mean, we have had that conversation about, you know, is even asking for block perimeter standards overly restrictive in terms of the creative and innovative things that we might want to see here. And I would imagine that at some point in the future, you may hear that the DRB is reviewing a proposal for somebody that can't exactly fit this mold because it wasn't exactly what we thought of. But we're trying to kind of put some structure there to help guide it in the direction of where we want to see it go.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, just put out there the requirements that you want without necessarily, you know, a grid. I don't know, it's really hard to do, huh?
Well, and things specifically like street design, you know, at this point, we do also have standards in our ordinance that we haven't been talking about here that look at things like the design of driveways and parking areas. You know, short of somebody actually dedicating these streets, they will not be considered full public streets. And so we do have some other kind of standards in the ordinance that help look at how some of these pieces of infrastructure meet some minimum kind of levels of design through other parts of the ordinance. We don't typically require street design though as part of our zoning ordinance. That's typically, especially for public streets, that falls outside of our zoning ordinance. So, you know, just trying to find the right balance there.
Just
Yeah.
grab that, take it. You know, exert your domain over the streets, Megan.
I would just, you know, I think one thing to be mindful of, like, I think it's fortunate Burlington is a fairly thriving city, and we have the experience of living in a thriving city. But if you've ever been on like a pedestrian mall or pedestrian only street in a place that is not thriving, it's like not so fun. And so I do think design, like I'm all about the multi-use paths. I raise it as a consideration. I don't think it's exactly relevant to this, but I think it's something we should be mindful of. You know, you can't really take a Church Street for granted because there are many former pedestrian malls that no longer exist because they just didn't work. I like B. If the developers are not you know, sort of giving too much pushback, I think it's great.
Would you like to see that additional sort of bike block level? So 2,400 feet for blocks bounded by cars, 1,600 for bike blocks, and 800 for pedestrian blocks, or?
No, actually, because I think because this concept of having a pedestrian only place sometimes being a little too lonely, I think I would encourage things to be you know, at least have bikes and pets together. I do think some of that concern is mitigated by the fact you've got Pine Street and then you've got the Parkway, and there will be a lot of activity on those, which I think was a great point that someone made there, or Charles made, I think.
Yeah, and the Parkway and Pine are also slated to have new multi-use paths themselves. So I would imagine if somebody's just using the district as a thoroughfare to get from south up to downtown or vice versa, they might take that direct route along the Parkway and Pine. But if they want a more meandering bike ride and to stop at some shops, they might take the internal network.
Makes sense.
Is that too
So
many? I mean, I
Charles-
guess I just phrased the question. Is it like too many? I don't know. Like, do we want to have it more, you know, our pedestrian activity more concentrated?
The other element of, in addition to these block perimeter standards that is in the ordinance, is a requirement for, there's a maximum building floor plate size and
Right.
kind of a maximum build out of the frontage. And so there will be some, at least visual permeability between buildings as well, even if we aren't mandating pedestrian pathways every 800 feet, for example.
That's right.
Right. It's a tough one. I still like B.
I will say that from a permitting perspective, option A is, I think, easier.
Yeah,
Leah?
I think, I hear you there, Charles. I think, I'm interested in the idea of different sorts of pedestrian pathways, because I think there can be sort of a, you know, multi-use path thoroughfare along the Champlain Parkway that's of a different hierarchy than, say, those like paths that go between buildings and like add articulation on a otherwise like static block. So I know, like, you know, maybe like there's an opportunity to differentiate between those two, or like just create different standards for those different types of pedestrian access points or paths. But, you know, like this, I like B as well. I think it also does look like a lot. And like, if I were a public works person, I'd be like, wow, that's a lot of, you know, sidewalks or paths to plow in the winter. So yeah, I'm interested in, you know, what that hierarchy or just those different dimensions might look like for different types of pedestrian pathways.
So Charles, do you have what you need at least for now?
I think I'm hearing support for concept B.
I might switch. It's hard to think through these just on the spot.
Yeah,
I like the simplicity of A actually as well. And I like that the actual minimum block for the car accessible street is smaller.
yeah, and Megan's point about the floor plate and the frontage standards, don't forget that, because I think that also achieves some of the goals you're talking about here about creating that porosity in the development. And, you know, realistically, if a developer is required to, you know, limit their floor plate and they've got a couple buildings, you know, in that space between, they're going to try and design that as nicely as possible and probably provide some pedestrian connectivity anyways.
So
So
it
you
sounds
could
like,
get something that's more like B, but it's just whether you're mandating B
Right.
as the, you know, the minimum requirement.
And-
Or
and-
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
so it sounds like people on the one hand are preferring B, but are leaning towards A as the flexibility. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think
You know-
that's,
I think,
I agree, Andy.
I
think
think
that's
that might be
accurate.
it then. Yeah, okay.
Part of what I'm struggling with is the size of the, like, what's a 1600 block perimeter? It's
Yeah,
one
so-
of those entire rectangles, right? Not the, like on both of your images, you've got 4 blocks actually, right?
right.
So having just been in Montreal over the weekend, have you been to Montreal, Alex?
I
Have
have.
any of you been there, like walked in the Mile End or the Plateau neighborhood?
Oh,
I
yeah.
think maybe an interesting example of how to think about some of these blocks is, you know, being kind of narrow on one end. So about half the length of one of our downtown blocks on one end, but maybe about 1.5 times the size of one of our blocks in the other direction, downtown. So I'm thinking about Mile End just because, you know, they have these like very narrow kind of east-west blocks, but kind of longer north-south blocks as you walk through some of the neighborhoods.
So if we choose option A, that's the minimum, but you know, a developer could do more.
No, it's the
A lot-
max.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Go ahead.
You cannot do larger than 1600. You can do smaller. You could do, you
Right.
know, yeah,
You could have greater porosity or granularity if you wanted
yes,
to. Okay.
yes. Manhattan blocks are 264 by 900. So these ones that are
Nine-
drawn on the left are smaller in both directions.
So like
Yeah.
900 going north-south.
Yeah, that would be, a Manhattan block would essentially be the entire length almost of, you know, the Innovation Center property, for example. Quite long, too long, many would say. But yes.
All right. Are we all set with this one then? I think we are, unless I hear something else.
Yeah, that was it. And we are coming up on time here. So we will add all of this language to the draft for your next meeting.
So yeah, I think this is probably a good stopping point for this discussion. But the next time, probably focus on the language, because I think we've gone through a lot of the big concepts. If that makes sense.
Okay. Does that mean you want to hold off on warning a public hearing, or would you like to warn a public hearing?
Well, I don't think it's ready for a public hearing. I don't think we have I assume what you have to do is make changes to what the
Yeah,
provisions are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my suggestion would be that we hold off till next time to be able to review, and also review with hopefully more of the commissioners. What, you know, the work that we've done, see the final language for it, and then that we could warn. But
Okay.
it seems like we don't have the final language to warn yet. That's my take on it, at least.
Okay.
Okay. So good. This has been a really good discussion again. Thank you, Charles, for all that work that you've done. So we'll move on to item 7, which are commissioner items. When is our next meeting? It's in 2 weeks.
October
next-
11th.
Okay, great. Okay. Any other commissioner items? Any committee reports? Okay, oh, yes, Julia.
I don't have a committee report, but I am in Colorado right now for the Colorado American Planning Association conference. So I hope to report back some interesting things for you all. And I'm also out here for other projects, but mostly what's relevant to this group is hopefully I'll have some knowledge from the conference.
Good, thanks. Look
I
forward to
thought it
hearing
looked
your,
like you were somewhere that is much lighter than all of our respective.
Yep.
all right, then we'll move on to item 7, which are minutes of communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications? Motion by Julia, seconded by Michael. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, raise your hand or say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications. Item 8 is adjournment. So motion to adjourn. Motion
I move-
by
I move
Alex,
we adjourn.
thank you, and seconded by Julia. I saw your hand go up. All those in favor of adjournment, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Again, thanks. I think these have been really good discussions on the south end. Julia, this is
Thank
how we
you.
are all the time. These great discussions.
All
Thank
the
you,
time.
Charles and Megan.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
the
Yes,
Very thoughtful discussions,
absolutely.
everyone. Have a
Yeah.
great night.
Thanks. Have a
Take
good
care.
one.
Charles and
Good
Mary.
night.
Good night.